They're recording.
All right, Tara or Joanna, were you wanting to do like introductions today at the front end or say something?
Sure. Yeah, that sounds good. So I'll turn on my video for a minute. So hello, everybody. I'm Tara Lansrath, the floodplain mapping coordinator with the Kansas Department of Agriculture. I'm happy to be here today. Hi, I'm Joanna Rolfe. I'm a floodplain mapping specialist on Tara's team. And I will be monitoring the chat. And if you have any technical difficulties or questions, you can ask me. Thank you. Thanks for joining.
Bill, did you want to introduce yourself with KDA? I think that rounds out KDA if you do.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Bill Pace, and I'm with KDA.
All right. Do we just want to go ahead and go down the list and have everybody else introduce themselves?
Yeah, that sounds good. If anybody wants to introduce themselves, so we know who's on the call, and if you have any specific topics you hope we go over, feel free to bring that up then. You can also use the chat if you'd rather.
Yeah. Carol Davidson, you're on the top of the list, I think. You may not be able to unmute. All right.
You should be able to unmute in the bottom left corner of the screen. It should allow you to mute or unmute yourself.
That's okay. We can skip over Dustin.
He doesn't have it. Okay.
Dustin Parks, do you want to introduce yourself?
Okay.
Oh, there you go. I see. Okay. Thanks, Dustin. Oh, I think Carol responded to there. Okay. All right, Garrett.
I'm Garrett Lust with Wilson and Company, civil engineer. I am just trying to learn, nothing in particular that I'm looking for, just trying to learn the process.
All right. Well, welcome, Garrett. Kevin Urban.
Hi, I'm Kevin Urban. I'm with the City of Salina. I'm in the Utilities Department, and I'm just here to learn too. Thanks.
Okay. Michael.
Yeah, Mike Armour, City of Wichita. Just kind of trying to get a little bit more information about the LOMA, LOMR process and everything that goes with it.
All right, welcome. Tex. Tex put his info in the chat, I see there, as long as William Heller. Welcome, both of you. Todd. No mic, no problem, Todd. I know Todd works for Mirrorstone Surveying. Welcome, Todd. Wayne.
Yes, Wayne Scritchfield with the City of Salina. I'm a engineer and land surveyor and just learning.
Welcome, Wayne. I think that's everybody on the list. I see.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Welcome.
Do you have any, did you guys have anything else you wanted to cover before we get going?
I just have one thing. I'm sorry, Joanna. Just so you know, the recording from yesterday, I know I got an email that one of you had missed that. So I can send that link if you want it, and we will get it up on our training website as well next week, so you can access that as well as the one from today. So we'll send a link out to that next week as a follow-up. And then Joanna, I think you were going to say something as well.
I was just going to mention that we'll have 3 poll questions throughout to the presentation today. And so for those continuing education credits, you'll need to answer those poll questions as they come up.
All righty. With that being said, I guess we'll go ahead and get kicked off here. Everybody should be able to see my screen again. As everybody knew from yesterday, my name is John Covey. I work for Wood and its former predecessor names, AMEC Foster Wheeler. Been with the company for 16 years, straight out of college, doing flood risk, flood control, urban stormwater, master drainage planning, so forth and so on for that 16-year term. Not an expert in everything by any means, and I'm always learning every day. So hopefully today we'll learn from each other as well. Yesterday we went through part 1. Hopefully everybody got a good nap in yesterday's workshop since it was the MT1 applications. Probably the basic application, MT-EZ and MT1 applications are pretty simplified. Today, we're going to go over the MT2 applications. I've actually got a little exercise that we're going to just go through on PowerPoint, a no-rise exercise, so everybody can see how the consultant looks at these things, and then we'll talk about some lessons learned. Just as for yesterday, we're looking at this, or I'm going to be talking about this a lot from a consultant's perspective, but certainly want to hear everybody else's perspective. And please, 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 please share your examples that you have. Good, bad, the ugly, it doesn't matter what it is. It's good to go over those so that everybody can learn. The LOMAC process in general and all the different application types can sometimes be confusing, so it's good to go through that. As discussed yesterday, hopefully coming out of this, you understand more of what the LOMAC process is. You understand what the MT1, MT2 applications are, and you pick up some lessons that have been learned over the years. And I hope we got a pretty small group, so I hope as we go, this is informal. Please ask questions as we go. Everyone benefits from it. And most importantly, even though I may have a clear eyes for dry eyes voice, I hope everybody has fun and we don't catch anybody snoring in the middle of the workshop. So format, same as yesterday, lectures, demonstrations, and as Joanna mentioned, we got 3 quizzes, little poll questions that we're going to go over. A quick refresher of what a LOMAC is. It's a letter of map change. And again, like we talked about yesterday, all the applications are basically divided into 2 types, either amendments, which don't physically change the effective map, or revisions. And revisions, they actually physically change the map. What you see on the map, what you see in the FIS, the flood insurance study, profiles, flowway data table, anything like that, anything that physically changes and is then redistributed, adopted and redistributed, those fall under the revision category. And those 2 types of revisions are basically a LOMR, a letter of map revision, which is basically FEMA's modification to the effective flood insurance map. They could be based off of physical changes or methodology changes. Maybe a study was done using regression hydrology to determine how much water gets to a particular point. And instead, that hydrology method was updated to a more detailed analysis, rainfall runoff method or something like that, where it actually physically changes the inputs of the hydrology, and therefore affects the hydraulics and the mapped water surface elevations. And so the idea is by going through that process, you physically change the map so that, you know, from that point forward, any regulatory measure would be measured based off of that. A CLOMR is the other revision type, and it's a conditional letter of map revision. And basically what that application process is it provides the ability for FEMA and the community to comment on a proposed project before anything is built, to make sure that it meets FEMA's regulatory requirements, the community's regulatory requirements, and as well the state's regulatory requirements. It's an important process because nobody wants to go out and do a lot of work, spend a lot of money just to find out that they're non-compliant. So a CLOMR is a very important piece of that. You know, if you're doing fill within a floodway, a CLOMR is absolutely a great step to make sure that you're going to be compliant before it's actually built. One thing to note with a CLOMR, just like a CLOMR-F before, a CLOMR being conditional doesn't actually revise anything. All it does is it indicates whether or not that project, if you build it as you proposed, would be recognized by FEMA and could be approved once you do a LOMR. So the process generally would be to do a CLOMR first, get that approved, build it as you said you would, and then file for a LOMR and get the LOMR approved so that it physically changes the map. Yesterday, I showed this table so that it depicts the different types of applications. The MTEZ was a LOMA only. As some of you may recall, a LOMA is for those properties or structures that have not been placed on fill. They're at grade. And then the MT1 applications that we talked about yesterday, those are all amendments, meaning they don't physically change the map. And those would include the LOMA, a CLOMA, a LOMR-F, or a CLOMR-F. And just as a refresher, the LOMR-F, it's a letter of map revision based off of fill. In other words, it's a letter of determination determining whether a parcel of property or a structure in which fill was placed after the effective date of the floodplain, whether or not that would be above or below the base flood elevation. Today, we're going to focus on the MT2 applications, which are revisions, revision type applications. They physically change the map. And we're going to talk about LOMR and CLOMR specifically. PMR, as you might recall from yesterday, is a physical map revision, though that is similar to a LOMR in its nature, except that it's at a larger scale. Multiple counties, large watersheds, things of that nature. I'm not going to focus heavily on the PMR process. If you have questions about the PMR process, I would encourage you to talk to Tara, Joanna, and Steve, the KDA folks, about that process. Pretty common whenever we do these type of studies is the no-rise certification. We talked about this yesterday. The exercise that we have today is actually going to be a no-rise certification example where we're placing fill in a floodway area. And so we are I'm going to step through the process of how we show a 0.0 foot rise. And then one thing to note is that when you do a no-rise, as I mentioned yesterday, if you have a no-rise certification from a professional engineer, technically speaking, you're not required to file a CLOMR before doing a LOMR. However, as we talked about before, a conditional determination or a CLOMR is certainly an appropriate activity. And in that context, you know, conditional determinations, they're intended to reduce those risks of noncompliance, as we talked about. So similar to a CLOMR-F, A CLOMR, but prior to making any sort of revision to the map or any construction activity, a CLOMR itself is a very good idea, or a CLOMR application. It's a good idea to process that to mitigate any potential issues. How much does that application cost? As you can imagine, since we're talking about physically changing the maps, there's more review required of the hydrology, hydraulics, any structure information that you're putting in there, or specialty flood control item, whether it be a levee or a dam. Those types of things require more stringent review by FEMA and their partners. And so you can see here that they're quite a bit more expensive. The CLOMR, the thing to bring up, like the CLOMR based off a new hydrology, bridge, culvert, channel, or combination thereof, is $6,500 to submit that application via the online LOMAC tool that we talked about yesterday. If you are doing a levee or berm activity, the cost of that activity, or the review cost of that activity, goes up by a little bit, $7,000, but they also charge $60 per hour. And that's the best way I can explain that $60 per hour is if you're dealing with like levees or dams, there is a lot more involved with making sure we'll talk about this in a little bit, but make sure you're abiding by 44 CFR 6510 levee requirements or dam flood control requirements. And so they actually will charge you on an hourly basis for review time on any of those type of applications, in addition to the $7,000. A common question I get asked is, what's a good estimate for how many hours they spend on that? To be honest, I've seen it range anywhere between 20 hours to 80 hours. It depends on the project. It depends on the scale of the project. And it could vary quite a little. Usually, if I am doing a CLOMR or a LOMR activity that involves something like this, I will just write it from a contractual standpoint with your contractor. I would just write it as a time and materials that would be a direct expense to the community or whoever the applicant is, so that it's reimbursed appropriately and you don't do a lot of change orders and what have you. The other thing to note, similar to yesterday, like a CLOMR-F versus a LOMR-F, just note if you do the CLOMR, you got to pay that fee. But then once construction activities are complete, you'll have to file a LOMR application. And again, there will be a fee for that application as well. Another thing that I wanted to point out is a LOMR based solely on submission of more detailed data. And then you'll notice that it's free there. I'm curious, has anybody ever filed a LOMR based solely on the submission of more detailed data? Has anybody done that on here? You can put it in the chat or not say anything. Okay. Well, if you have more detailed data, or let's say that a mapping project comes out and you notice an error in the mapping data, you can actually file an application after it's gone effective. You can file a LOMR application and write up what you believe is an error, or if you have more detailed information that improves the map, meets FEMA compliance, regulatory compliance, you can submit that as and basically ask that it be considered free because you're just updating it based off of better information. I don't know. I mean, Tara, Joanna, you may know the answer to this, but have we ever had an example of this where it was newer topography was used to do that? I'm not aware of one, but I just wanted to ask.
I'm not aware of anything.
Yeah, I actually don't think that they do that. I think that it usually has to be a measure or a parameter that is there's a technical reason it's in error, or you have performed an analysis that that overwrites an existing analysis that did not meet FEMA's methods. I think that is true. I have not seen very many of those, to be honest with you. So, okay. So the MT2 application timeline, like we talked about yesterday very briefly, it's a little more extensive. As you may recall, the LOMA process was minutes. The MT1 applications typically take, like the LOMAs and LOMR-Fs, those usually are done within 60 days. The review process is done within 60 days. In this case, once they receive the application, they have 90 days to review the information that was provided and provide comments back. Then there's a time frame. You usually have 90 days to respond to those comments. And then depending on whether or not the issues are resolved, you're another 90 days away from them reviewing how you addressed it. And then there's a 4.5 month appeal period or adoption period before the LOMR can become effective. So as you might imagine, if you get stuck in a cycle where you're trading comments back and forth, those 90 days can add up quite a bit. And so one of the lessons learned that I just want to go ahead and throw out there is, as soon as you receive comments, as a state of practice, we encourage picking up the phone and calling the reviewer and just walking through and resolving each comment as best you can verbally, as opposed to it being a letter writing campaign. That typically doesn't get resolved nearly as quickly as just calling them and say, hey, this is the way we understand your comment. This is how we're planning on resolving it. If we do it that way, do you see any issues? Just to make sure that you address any issues and you reduce the time frame for the application process. So like it says here, on average, I mean, this can take anywhere to 6 to 12 months, depending on how many comments are received and how many back and forth things that you go through. Are there any basic questions about the refresher that we just went over before I get right into the meat of the application material?
I think we have a first poll here. Watch it. Was somebody trying to ask a question? I'm not sure if I interrupted somebody.
Okay. So the first poll question is, what does the C stand for in CLOMR? A, conditional, B, contemporary, C, cool, and D, classified. I think we got most of everybody to respond there.
Yeah, okay, I'll go ahead and close it.
So as everybody guessed, the correct answer is A, conditional. All right.
Yeah.
Started off with an easy one today. All right, the MT2 applications and process. So what is the MT2 application? Applications, actually, there's multiples. What does it cover? Where to find them, their requirements, and some instructions and resources. As we talked about, the MT2 applications are actually, it's a revision type of application. It changes the map. LOMR and CLOMR are the two that fall into that category, as well as PMR, but we're not going to talk about PMR today. And as you might guess, or as we talked about, the MT2 applications, if you're trying to change the BFE, the floodway boundary, floodplain boundary, any properties within alluvial fans or coastal areas, any structures that are elevated on fill in which you want to change the floodway for that, are all applicable type things that you would want to follow the MT2 application. There are actually 6 different application forms as part of the MT2 application. We'll go over every single one of these except forms 4 through 6. Not a lot of those here in Kansas, but forms 1, 2, and 3, I'm gonna put a lot of focus on those because those are much more prevalent. The overview and concurrence form, the riverine hydrology and hydraulics form, and the riverine structures form. In addition to the forms, however, there are a lot of other things that need to be submitted. And similar to yesterday, I like to look at things in table form and kind of have things listed out. So here is a table that kind of lists all the things that typically will be submitted with the LOMR or CLOMR application. The project narrative, I think it is technically written on the form like it's suggested to provide it. I consider it a requirement though. Before you ever submit one of these applications, it's always a good idea, even if it's just a memo, just to have a memo that explains the project, what you're doing, the limits of your project is very valuable to the reviewer because it helps confine them to what they're trying to review and what they're looking at. It's a very important item, and for any LOMR or CLOMR that we've submitted, we always have reports that an engineer will even seal to basically document, you know, if we're doing new hydrology, hydraulics, what the project area is, what in the mapping is changing, so forth and so on. Then those, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other items after that are the forms themselves. The overview and concurrence form is required in all cases, in all submissions. And then you just use the other forms if they're applicable. The other additional things that should be required or have to be required, a certified topographic map. For those on here, that might seem a little silly for those that are GIS inclined, because everything we do is pretty much on LiDAR anymore these days. And so usually what I do to try to satisfy that is I will provide a map with contours on it so that they can see it. I don't know a single reviewer that actually bases their evaluation on that map, but rather I provide the GIS LiDAR, the DEM, the digital elevation model, a GIS file that, along with the metadata, which basically states the vertical accuracy of the information. If you have questions about that, I know KDA does a lot of help with finding GIS data like that. But if you go to the Kansas DASC, what does DASC stand for again? Excuse me, Joanna, Tara. Data access.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Got it. But yeah, data access and support center.
There you go. If you go on there, they do have a lot of metadata up there, where we oftentimes will download the data that we use for these projects. And I'll submit that. There is a place on the overview and concurrence. I think it's on the overview and concurrence form that talks about the topographic source that you're using. So you'll want that information. The annotated firm reflecting all the changes. So basically we produce the same maps that the firm is on, that shows all the changes that have been made. Any design plans. So if this is a project that's based off of putting fill somewhere which changes the floodplain, or you're building a levee of some kind, all those as-built and design plans will be included. Since we are making a change to the map, then that means any of those properties that are affected by that change needs to be notified, because it's a part of the adoption and appeal periods. That's a regulatory requirement. So you have to provide notification, whether that be via letter, certified mail letter to the property owners, or a newspaper, posted in a newspaper for a period of time. And then you have to provide that documentation to FEMA showing that you have satisfied notifying the property owners that are impacted. And then, as well as the annotated firm, we provide all NFIP mapping regulatory requirements, so that an updated FIS, updated profiles, flow data tables. I'll show a couple examples of how we do that in here. We talked about the Endangered Species Act compliance. It's required for CLOMR submissions. That tool, the IPAC tool, is a very valuable tool that you'll want to use. If there are any other questions, I'm not going to go back over that today, but if there are any questions about it, feel free to let me know. Can certainly go through that. And then if you're submitting this application via snail mail, packaging everything up and then sending it to FEMA, you'll need the payment information form as well. So all these things are required. These are generally the forms and information that are required. It does get more complicated, I will admit. If you are doing a riverine structures form where you're doing a levee, you're putting a levee in, it gets a lot more complicated, because now you have a whole nother set of criteria that you have to meet. You have to show concurrence, that you're meeting the guidelines for, like I said, like 44 CFR 6510 requirements. That involves freeboard, embankment protection, stability, geotechnical, all that type of stuff has to be included in addition to what you see on this screen right here. So the examples I'm going to give today are going to be more common and typical, but just understand that there could be more information required depending on how complex the project is. So as I mentioned, the project narrative is very important. It informs a reviewer of the project and the purpose, provides a graphical representation of where that project is. And also what's kind of overlooked sometimes is if there's any phasing of the project. So if you're doing a construction project and you're planning on doing this in multiple phases, this is where you would define how those phases are being done so that FEMA can review that. And then also discuss any of the methods, such as your hydrology and hydraulic methods that you're doing, and make sure that those conform to FEMA's approved methodologies that they have. Okay, I'm not going to go over the compliance. You bring up each form and we're going to step through each one of them. Okay, so this is the overview and concurrence form, or what we called Form 1. This is the first form of the MT2 application. And I guess I should take one step backwards. If you go to the website, this is the main web page for the MT2 application forms. And for whatever reason, they don't even have the forms on here. So, and it even has the notes that says expired MTEZ, MT1, and MT2 forms may be used until further notice, but they don't have the forms on here. So if you need the forms, I'll provide those to Joanna and Tara may already have them, but I'll make sure that somebody has them so that you can just request those from the state. I don't know why they're not up here, but And maybe Joanna, Tara, if you guys know where they're at, that would be great, because I've scoured through the web pages trying to find it, and it is like hidden like you wouldn't believe. So
I don't know offhand. They have done a lot of changes to their web pages the last year. So I can look some though. I'll look while we're talking, actually, see if I can find more.
okay. The one thing they do have on here, which is kind of useful, is this MT2 instructions. I'll try to, I do have that one downloaded. I can open up. It's pretty useful because it does a good job. Well, it does a pretty good job explaining all the different forms that are on here and how to make sure you're completing ESA compliance and what have you. The other thing, and I was going to show this later, but while we're here, I can show it now. They actually have examples for notification, which are pretty handy and very useful. So like here's an example of a public notification for a LOMR when placed in a newspaper. You know, they've got letter examples that they can use, that you can use, which is pretty valuable. And, you know, they got one for LOMR and CLOMRs as well. So just keep that in mind. You don't have to come up with that off the cuff. These actually do work. We've used them in the past and filled in all the blanks. And usually there's some supplemental stuff that we'll put in there, but in general, these are pretty useful. Okay, back to the form. So this is the first form, first box. Are you doing a conditional letter of map revision application, or are you doing the LOMR, the letter of map revision application? So you just checkbox the one, whichever one it is. Keep in mind, if you do a CLOMR, you need to make sure that you're providing the ESA compliance documentation. That's going to be required. Down here, you would list any communities that are affected by your project. One common thing that gets done in error is people forget to include certain communities. Maybe it barely touches the corner. The floodplain barely touches the corner of the community. Make sure all of them are listed on here so that each one is being properly notified. Make sure to put in the flooding source. And if you have multiple flooding sources, you're going to have to put all the flooding sources in here. So if you have multiple creeks that are being impacted, you would want to put those here. And also on the flooding source, don't forget backwater. So if you're doing a main channel, but it affects the backwater on another stream, then you'll want to make sure to include the backwater area as an affected source as well. Types of flooding. So, you know, here in Kansas, it's primarily riverine. We do have some shallow flooding though, type areas and lakes certainly. Any project, special project name or identifier, I'll usually put like the project number and then whatever the name of that project is there. Which zones are affected. And, you know, typically it's these that are noted here. And then the basis for revision request. So why are you requesting a LOMR to be changed? And this one can be a little subjective, I guess would be the best way of going through it. So a physical change would, you know, that could be like you're just trying to change the information that's on there, the floodplain, the floodway, improve methodology or data. So like I mentioned before, if you were doing a regression equation, or that's what the effective was, but then you're using rainfall runoff method for hydrology, you would checkbox that. If you're trying to change the floodway itself, that's what this box here is for. Base map changes, so maybe some roads changed, or you know, you got a better aerial or something like that. You might checkbox that. Coastal analysis is kind of what it sounds like. And then hydrology and hydraulics. These two here. So if you're doing new hydrology, given the example I had before, you would checkbox this and I would checkbox this. In this example here, I'm just selecting hydraulic analysis because we're not doing the example that I have that we're going to go through later. I'm just doing a hydraulic analysis. I'm not actually changing hydrology. Corrections, this would be for anything that you feel was in error in the previous effective. Maybe they had an elevation printed wrong on the map or in the floodway data table. That's what these would be. Weir and dam changes, levee certification. We talked briefly about those. Alluvial fans. We don't really have much of these in Kansas, but I've done work in like Utah or Colorado or Nevada. They certainly all have alluvial fans that we've dealt with. Natural changes would be like, if you have a channel that erodes heavily over time and maybe it moves 100 feet, it completely changes the course. That would be this button here. Of course, if that example is true, like if it is a channel change, you might have new topography. So you would checkbox that and you would use new topography to base your application on. And then any that don't kind of fall into those general categories gets the other, and then you put a description. Here is that note that I was talking about where it says, a photograph or narrative description of the area concern is not required, but it's very useful. That's what I was talking about before, where providing that project narrative is a good practice just to make sure that you're helping the reviewer to speed up the review process. Okay, the area revision encompasses the following structures. So if you have structures that are being impacted or that you're planning or proposing, this is where you would checkbox those. So if you're channelizing, you're changing the channel somehow or creating an overflow bypass channel, maybe you're making an improved channel, a concrete line channel or something like that, that would be this button here. A levee or flood wall, it is kind of what it says. If you're proposing a change to a levee or dike, or maybe you're proposing to put one in that doesn't exist, that would go here. Warn you now, if you have a project that involves that, you'll want to make sure that you get somebody on board that really understands that process, because there's a lot of other requirements that go along with that. Bridge and culvert's pretty common. So if you've got, you're trying to replace a bridge or a culvert of really any kind on a regulatory stream, then you'll want to checkbox that. Dam is also an example. Again, a dam could have quite a few additional regulatory items. Certainly, all these, you got to make sure you're following state regulatory requirements, stream obstruction, floodplain fill. Contact Janelle Phillips and or the folks on this call. They'll help you out. Make sure you get the right application forms for those. And the example we're going to show here in a minute is a fill application. So we're going to be placing fill in a floodway. So that's why that one is checked. And then anything that doesn't fall into those categories, you select other. Since this is a CLOMR, in this example that we're doing, we're going to make sure we're providing documentation of the ESA compliance using the similar method as what we had before. Again, just note, if you're dealing with levees, you're dealing with dams, channelization, anything like that, you're going to have United States Army Corps of Engineers, 404, 408, EPA. You're going to have a lot more compliance documentation to provide along with an application like this. Wetlands, all those, you're going to check all those boxes to make sure that they're being accommodated. Review fee, yep, and this is where you checkbox that and you put it in here if you've got one. If I, like what we talked about before, if you're trying to do a correction or you're trying to update it based off of better information, you can select no here, but make sure you provide an explanation. And that project narrative can be your explanation as long as it's written very well. But you definitely want to make sure to address this so that the FEMA reviewer can understand what's going on and why you feel a fee is not warranted in that example. Signature by those submitting it is right here. And then right here is the community acknowledgement form. So the MT1 application had its own form that we kind of looked at. This is included right here. Just one thing to note, remember, if you had multiple communities listed up here, then you should have multiple forms like this filled out and acknowledged by those communities. What I'll oftentimes do is I'll like cut this out and I'll submit a copy of this for each community so that the FEMA reviewer can see that every community has acknowledged, has reviewed and acknowledged the application. That's a common thing. As I mentioned before, missing the community is a common thing that happens. As well as acknowledging them, just make sure that you give them the opportunity to review it, because that's another thing they will immediately turn around and say that you haven't met if you haven't gotten all the communities addressed. Certification by the engineer or land surveyor goes here. The difference between the MT1 and MT2 applications is you have those additional forms that you have to go through. The example we're going to have is just the hydrology and hydraulics example, because we're just placing fill. We're not changing structures or anything like that. Like we're not doing a levee or a bridge or something. But if you have those, you would checkbox these and make sure that you're filling out those forms and including those. That is the overview and concurrence form. Are there any questions about this form before I go to the other forms?
Nothing new in the chat.
Hey, John, I got a question. Because of how extensive the MT2 process is, whenever there's like a LOMR that's denied, what are the next steps that needs to be done?
If a LOMR is just outright denied, like when you say denied, do you mean you've gone back and forth with FEMA and they have basically just outright not going to approve it?
Well, I guess you get that first initial denial, I guess for you to review your work type of situation.
Yeah, so if we submit an application, hopefully it's a CLOMR application, but let's say you submit the application, they come back with comments. They're going to come back with a list of comments that basically state why you're not in compliance. And what I do as a state of practice, as I mentioned before, is I basically pick up the phone. First, I look at their comments. I attempt to address them myself and propose changes that I'm going to make to satisfy their requirements. And then I call the reviewer, because the reviewer is usually listed. You'll have their contact information. I call them directly and I basically walk through each comment and resolution with them to resolve it. Once that is done, once they have kind of verbally acknowledged that I'm on the right track and that should I follow what I just said I would do, would be approved, I'll put together a memorandum for that letter the letter that they give you, and I'll address every single item that they address, and I'll have their comment, and then I'll have my response to their comment satisfying the requirement. With that, I provide that memorandum along with any supporting data or information. Let's say that I missed a floodway data table change or something like that. I will submit that supporting information back to FEMA so that they can then again review it and make sure that I've addressed all their requirements. One common thing that always happens pretty much anytime I'm doing these is I typically will submit, when I submit the first time, it never goes through the first time. And not the reason isn't because I'm a horrible application person. The reason is because for the notification to the community, I submit the example of what I'm planning on proposing, putting in the newspaper or the letters and the contacts that I'm proposing to contact. I get FEMA to look at that and make sure that I'm addressing that requirement with my draft information. If they come back and that is the only requirement left, then I'll process the notification and send documentation proving that I have notified all the appropriate people for the certain time frame, and I provide that to FEMA so that they can check that box and make sure that that's been accomplished. Does that answer your question, or did I answer the wrong question?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. All right, let's go to the riverine and hydrology form. Okay, riverine hydrology and hydraulics. So once again, I fill this out. You have your flooding source or sources. Since this was the example we're going to go through here in a moment, you're going to notice I'm not changing hydrology. So I'm going to checkbox not revised, meaning nothing about the hydrology is changing. But let's say that something is changing. Maybe you didn't know what the flows are. It was a zone A. You had no idea what the flow rates are. There wasn't a previous model. You might check that there was no existing analysis. If you're updating it from regression to that rainfall runoff model, you're probably going to use improved data. If you're using a different methodology, maybe for those engineers that are on here, maybe the previous study was a rainfall runoff model. It used Clark's SES or Clark's transform method, and you want to use the SES transform method. That would be an alternative methodology. Or another example would be the previous effective model was done using like a HEC HMS model, and you want to use a swim model because you have a bunch of stormwater pipes and urban stormwater areas. You want to use a different methodology, then you would checkbox that. I will warn you, you were talking about whether an application is free or not. If you just change from HEC HMS to say swim, and you cannot prove that that HEC HMS model was bad, like it was incorrect, how it was done, they usually will not accept an alternative methodology as being free. What they might accept as being free is if you couldn't find one, you didn't know there wasn't one, or you found an error in the previous analysis, that might be considered free. But just changing it from one, in that example, rainfall runoff method to another rainfall runoff method, I have heard less success of that even happening at all. So just be aware of that. Not that your methodology couldn't be reviewed, approved, and accepted. They're just not going to consider it as a free application typically. Proposed conditions, you would checkbox that if you're doing a CLOMR. So if I'm not revising it here, but if we were, I would checkbox that. Or a changed physical condition in the watershed. Maybe when a study was done somewhere else, way up in the watershed beyond the FEMA regulatory limits, maybe a whole chunk of the basin was cut off and rerouted due to development. That could be a reason why this would change, because the watershed itself has physically changed from what the original study was done. And so all you're doing is updating the drainage area and redoing the hydrology based upon that. That would be a perfectly good example of what would be used there. Here you would put in representative 1% annual chance discharges. So where, what I typically will do here, because they only have 3 spots here, I put this in the report, in the project narrative, because we typically have more than 3, but you might have only 1 or 2, which fits here. But what I'll do is I'll basically just say see project narrative report or study report for the table, and all these will be mapped out basically. So you'll have your effective FIS discharges and what those have been changed to. If you're doing a new methodology for a new hydraulic analysis or hydrologic analysis, these are the ones you would check. I don't want to go all geeky on the engineering stuff on here, but you know, if you're doing statistical regression, precipitation or rainfall runoff model, that's what this is, or other, you would just checkbox those and explain them. Again, that project narrative is very useful because it defines all the parameters that you need. It basically just checks this box and you put see the description for it. Make sure all the models, computations, if you wrote it on the back of a bar napkin, make sure those are included when you submit it, or you're going to get questioned about it. They typically don't like just changing flows to change flows. One thing that I want to bring up here, because this has actually recently happened, is when you're doing a mapping change, and I probably should have said this at the very front end, make sure that you contact the state of Kansas to see what mapping projects are going on out there. There may be other information that's out there that could be used for your study. We've recently had an example, I've actually heard of multiple examples like this, where FEMA, somebody will do a study, they'll submit it through the LOMAC process, or this LOMR process or CLOMR process. FEMA, they don't really do a very good job keeping tabs on what's going on in the localities. So contacting the state and just saying, hey, what mapping projects do you have active in this area is a really good idea, because you could see what kind of information is already available that you could build off of, and or make sure if there is a mapping project, you're not doing something that completely contradicts what they're doing, and what you're doing could inform that mapping project. So I know that sounds pretty obvious to everybody probably on here, but it's just something to keep in mind, because this has recently happened to us in another jurisdiction, not in Kansas, and it's really discouraging for everybody involved, including the community, when something like that happens, because then you've got 2 completely different sets of hydrology, 2 completely different sets of methodologies, and you got to figure out which one is the right, and you never want to design or build something when you got conflicting information like that. So just one thing to note there when we're doing this. Sorry for that little tangent. If the community requires anything, just make sure that's documented. If you've done the community acknowledgement form, you should address this issue. But if you're doing something like in a jurisdictional BAM for the Corps, you want to make sure that their evidence of approval and review is provided as well. Impacts of sediment transport. If you've got a location where you know sediment directly impacts your hydrology, you'll want to include that, and then you'll also want to scroll down and fill out the form for it. Hydraulics. For each flooding source, you need to name the upstream and downstream limits for which is to be revised, cross sections, and the elevations. make sure, and this always happens, make sure that your upstream and your downstream limits tie in. So from a consultant's perspective, whenever you're doing a study, go upstream a cross section or two, go downstream a cross section or two, and just make sure that you are tying in 100% to the effective study. That is a common error that happens is you stop your study and FEMA reviews it and they say, well, you didn't tie into the effective upstream and downstream. And so you need to go back and reevaluate and make sure that it matches within a ½ foot. So just keep that in mind. If you're doing the model, if you have these models, these are file name, plan names. These are actually pretty important to go ahead and fill out so that the reviewer knows what they're looking at. I'm going to talk about what duplicate, corrected, and all those things are here in a moment. Here are the mapping requirements that I was talking about before. So as I mentioned, I usually select this digital mapping. I always submit the digital elevation model, and then I type in what the source of the information is and the accuracy standard that source has. And then of course, make sure, as we talked about, that you have the annotated firm or FBFM checked here, and you've provided those maps as part of the review process. Some other regulatory requirements. These are just basic questions. So are you increasing the BFEs? Yes or no? Since this is actually part of a no rise, the example we're going to go through, I got no there. If you're doing a CLOMR, you better have your evidence of compliance for ESA. Does the LOMR request cause an increase in BFA compared to the effective? Yes or no? If you are increasing the water surface elevations anywhere, then you need to provide owner notification. It's big bold letters right here. So just keep that in mind. If you're doing a no rise and the 1% annual chance does not change, then you're not subject to that same notification requirement necessarily. But you definitely want to at least make sure that you're checking this. Does a request involve placement of proposed fill? Yes. And if yes, you must make sure that the community acknowledges it. For LOMR requests, is the regulatory floodway being revised? In our example, we're going to say yes. If you're doing a fill, you have a no rise, you're not planning on changing the floodway, you would select no. For CLOMR requests, please submit to FEMA, the community, to show you completed sections 9 and 10 of the Endangered Species Act. Again, that's for CLOMRs. That's pretty much it. Are any questions on the riverine hydrology and hydraulics form? Okay, none. Riverine structures. So our example doesn't have any riverine structures, but I'll just go ahead and walk through this. Flooding source is as it sounds before. Depending on the type of activity that you have, there are certain sections that you complete. So if you got a project that includes channelization and bridges, then you could put those in here and you can select both of those as items, and then you would have to complete section B and section C of this form. Name of the structure, what type it is. We kind of already went over what the types are and where they're located. Make sure to talk about what the upstream and downstream limits are of that chain. So if you're doing channelization, then you'll want to put the cross sections upstream and downstream where they start and stop. If you're doing bridges, you want the upstream cross section and downstream cross section placed there. And then similar to channelization, levees, upstream and downstream cross sections of those limits. If you have more than 3, then you need to do another form for those other activities. And if you have a lot of them, you may want to just do one of these forms for each activity so that they're all accommodated. So for channelization, same information there. You talk about what the channel was designed to carry and or what your frequency event. There's a lot of engineering stuff in here that I'm not sure I want to get into for this crowd, but you check the different flow regimes. You talk about if you have a hydraulic jump in the modeling, check all those and of how you're affecting stability of the channel. So you'll check all those. Make sure you put in the channel design plans. Again, that was in our little table before. So if you're doing a proposed project, you want the design plans included. Usually if you have like a channelization and you have a sudden hydraulic jump where you have some stability issues, you may have other things like a drop structure or some other transition between cross sections or something to stabilize the channel. So you would check any of those that are applicable. Again, make sure they're included in the design plan so that they can review them. Sediment transport, again, you have a lot of sediment transport in your study area, checkbox that. Bridge culverts, this revision, it reflects if you're changing a bridge or culvert that wasn't modeled. So if you're adding one that wasn't modeled previously, you put it there. If you're modifying one that was in the FIS, you put that, you checkbox that. Or if the bridge it hasn't changed, but you're revising how it's analyzed, you would checkbox this one. Put in the hydraulic model that you're using to analyze the structure. And then all this other information comes from your design plans that you fill out, especially anything that is changing. You'll want to checkbox all those. Sediment transport again. Dams, so you have an existing dam that you're modifying, you're putting in a new dam or modifying an existing dam, whichever is applicable. So if you have an existing dam that was missed and you want to include it, that would be this one. If you have a new one, you go there. If you're modifying an existing one that was previously mapped, you checkbox that one. The dam base was designed, so who designed it? Checkbox that. And how's it being permitted? I talked about that previously. Make sure we're following the state of Kansas dam permitting requirements, Ambrose, or if it's a federal dam, the Corps for sure. Make sure they're all involved. Usually, if you're doing a dam, you're going to have these both checkbox because both the state and the federal side are going to check off to make sure you're okay. Private dam, what have you, local government dam, checkbox those. Usually if you're doing a dam, a lot of times you're revising hydrology, so you checkbox yes here, but sometimes not. Maybe the dam was already there, you're updating the dam somehow, but for whatever reason it doesn't change hydrology, you would check no. And obviously if you checkbox yes, you better have form 2. Was the dam designed using critical duration storm? Again, I don't want to get into what like the engineering terms here, but when you're dealing with dams, the critical event isn't necessarily the one that has the highest peak runoff. It could be the one that just has the highest volume amount, and therefore that storm would be utilized. There are a few areas that do this. St. Louis has examples of this, Illinois, and there's some other areas that do this type of analysis. So if you're doing that, you'll want to provide the documentation how that was done. Debris and sediment, again. So the reason they're asking this question is they're wanting to look for adverse impacts of the dam. if the base flood elevation is changing upstream because you increase the height of the dam and now it floods into a bunch of homes, they're going to want to know the answer to that. So you'll checkbox those. These are all still water elevations. So if it was in the FIS as a dam, you'll put those there. And then if they've been revised, you put those there. There is specifically a still water elevation table in the FIS if the dam was included that you would want to include. And then last but not least, you don't want to forget the operation and maintenance plan for a dam, especially if you have like gated structures or anything like that. Levee flood wall, I'm a little bit behind right now on schedule, but if you're doing a levee and flood wall analysis, if you're upgrading one, checkbox that. If it's new, checkbox that. If it's a reanalysis of an existing one, maybe you're changing a structure, but you're not changing the levee itself, you're still going to want to reanalyze it, a portion of it, at least to check the box that levee certification is still met. We actually have an example of that going on right now. Levee elements and locations, what type of levee is it? Is it an earth embankment or a flood wall? Maybe it's both. So you'll want to check all that apply there. These are all design things, and we can get into those. So has the levee flood wall system been certified better by a federal agency to provide protection from the base flood? This is a very important one because if you checkbox yes, meaning you, and usually if your intent is to build a levee, you want it to do this, then you're gonna have to check yes, and you're gonna have to say which agency it was certified by. So a good example would be Salina, you have a levee system, City of Wichita has a levee system, Topeka has a levee system, Manhattan has a levee system. All those levee systems have pretty much, for the large part, have been through a certification process, at least those protecting communities anyways. Those have gone through that process. And so, you're going to select yes, and you're going to put FEMA here because they have already been through that certification process, which means if you're making a change, you have to go back through that process to make sure that those requirements are still met. That's very important. Make sure you put all the certified drawings and they have specific things that they want to see. And you put the sheet numbers on here. And then for those that have been through certification, the rest of these are going to be the actual requirements of 44 CFR 6510. So you have freeboard requirements. Those are all listed right here. And I'm not going to go through all of those. Closures, if you're putting flat gates or sluice gate operations, those are right here. Geotechnical and geological data, very important. If you're doing a new levee, you need to provide that information. That's right there. Embankment protection is one. So they want to make sure that the embankment of the levee is not is scour proof. It's not going to erode away and cause potential failure. So you're going to go through all these exercises. What are the slopes? What's the cover on the embankment? What are the velocities? Whether they're velocity or even shear stress, make sure that that's all documented on here. I'm going to skip over some of this. If somebody has a specific question, I can certainly answer it, but there's a lot of technical stuff in here, and I'm not sure people want to hear me go through. Oh, one thing that's often overlooked is interior drainage with levees. That is a requirement. If you are changing even something in the channel part, maybe you're adding a little check dam or something. If it changes the riverine condition, you'll want to make sure to understand how the interior drainage is impacted. And interior drainage, basically, they're required per the CFR to map all the interior areas of the levee system, because if the pipes are closed, they want to understand what's at risk. So anything that changes that potential risk, they're going to want documented. That's what this section here is for. And then there's the sediment transport finally at the very bottom there. Are there any questions about this form? There's a lot of technical stuff in here. Okay, hearing none. That was the last form that I wanted to go through in detail. Just know that there are the 3 other forms, the coastal analysis and those other ones. They're not really applicable to Kansas, so I don't want to spend a ton of time going through those, but they're here, and just know that they exist anyways. Okay. If you're doing a snail mail option for the submission, this is where you would send it to, similar to the CLOMR-F and LOMR-F, LOMAs, or you can do it online, and it's usually quicker to do it online, as we talked about previously. You just have a lot more data to upload because you're uploading models, you're uploading design plans, you're uploading a lot of information. One thing just to kind of show everybody, whenever you do this, I usually will do it in the order of that table, and I'll have each of these documented. So like for the certified topography, I'll have the metadata in here, and I'll have a report that talks about it. If you're doing the mapping changes, so if I go to this proposed regulatory, let me just open up an example of a, so I'll box off the area that's changing and say that it's been revised. And I do the same thing for all the profiles. Any profile that's impacted, I'll do that as well. So you can see the box, and then I mark it as revised. Are there any questions about the forms or what's being submitted there? Did I drown everybody?
No questions in the chat, but we a poll right now.
Just to check if they're still awake, right?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, it was sounding weird to me.
Echoed for a minute, but it seemed
Okay, there was an echo. Okay, I thought there might be an echo, but it's gone away. I don't know. I'll go ahead and launch that poll. And this is multiple choice again. So hint, it's more than one.
So the question is, if you were to submit the CLOMR application for proposed bridge in a Kansas river, what MT2 forms would you need? Select all that apply.
We'll leave this one up for longer since it does take you some, you have to think about it more. We'll leave it up long enough so that everybody can get a chance to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Know.
This one makes you think a little bit longer.
John, have you had to do any that have a coastal form?
I haven't done them myself, but I did help out on one in North Carolina. Yeah, as you can imagine, we don't get a lot of coastal here in Kansas.
Probably should get none, actually.
Not very many, if any, VE zones that I'm aware of in the state of Kansas.
All right. I'll give it a couple more seconds. If you're not sure, still go ahead and just answer, because that way we have you marked down and can get you that continuing education credit. I'm going to close the poll here in a moment. Okay. We had 2 more respond to the last one, so. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now.
Okay, so the answers should have been overview and concurrence one. That's required for all submissions for LOMRs or CLOMRs. Riverine hydrology and hydraulics form, certainly applicable because you're probably going to be doing new hydraulics or of some nature, so that one would be put. The riverine structures form, because it's a bridge, then you'll want that form. I see somebody marked alluvial fan. Here in Kansas, we don't have a lot of those, but if you had an alluvial fan that went over a bridge, I could certainly see that being applied. Typically in Kansas, we don't have that, so I don't think I had that as the yes answer, but that's certainly, I could see a reason why somebody would select it. Payment information form, unfortunately, none of these are free usually, so yeah, we got to submit that if you're not doing it online. And then the ESA compliance documentation is required because this is a CLOMR. So A, B, C, G, and H certainly all most likely applicable here. Good job. Okay, let's get to the example. So we've got this site, we got a client, he wants to build a house on fill in an area impacted in the 100-year floodplain. No plan to have a basement. We're tasked with designing the building pad, which takes them out of the floodplain without causing any negative impacts. This site just so happens to be in a floodway. So since it's in a floodway, that means we need to look at no rise, see if we can achieve a no rise. And if not, then we definitely are going to have to do a LOMR to make sure that we adjust the mapping accordingly if we can't get a no rise for sure. So first thing we always do that ESA evaluation. So I performed an IPAC analysis, sent a letter to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, basically determined that, there wasn't anything of concern. I'll try to mitigate, as we talked about before, any migratory birds or endangered species issues. Make sure that we're checking for wetlands and communicating with both the state and the local government. Make sure that there's not any potential issues that anybody's aware of. We'll try to obtain the effective model if one exists. If an effective model does not exist, we'll create what they call is a duplicate effective model. In other words, we'll try to reproduce the model as it is on the effective if we can. In this example here, the black lines that are shown, those are the cross sections from the effective model. And in this example, we were able to find the effective model. We have it, we downloaded it. And so that is what we're starting from. So we're not going to have to do a duplicate effective. Just know that if you are in an area that has an effective mapping in which a model is not available, FEMA is going to require you to create that duplicate effective and get it as close as you can to being realistic. They prefer it to match the effective, but I have seen cases where you just try as you may, something in the watershed change, it will never match. And if that's the case, then you're usually talking about having to do a mapping update where you change the hydrology, hydraulics, and everything else. And you're probably not going to get a no rise based off of that. You'll want to do a CLOMR, let's just put it that way, because you want FEMA to give you comment on what you're doing. Corrected effective is basically taking that the duplicate effective model. If the duplicate effective is the effective, you basically are updating that model so that you can better analyze the changes that you're going to make. So you're going to add cross sections. If you have any mannings updates that you want to make, so roughness, any site grading changes that may have been occurred, you're going to get that model updated to what's there today. FEMA and the state, they do a really good job trying to make sure that they're mapping flood risk appropriately. But there are certainly cases between cross sections and things where they're not going to be able to analyze every single square inch of the watershed. I say all that, but now we're doing 2D modeling. That's a whole nother ball game. But in the 1D realm, just know that, or at least understand that the point of the corrected effective model is to update it so that when you're doing a comparison back to it for the proposed conditions, you're comparing how it's going to affect the actual conditions today. If you're adding cross sections, one common thing I see engineers always accidentally do is they don't update the reach links. Make sure to update those reach links when you do that. And also try to keep mannings consistent. So if you're adding cross sections, look at the mannings upstream and downstream and try to be consistent with how that original study was done. You don't, unless you see an error in how it was done, update those errors. But other than that, you don't want to try to change it drastically between the different cross sections because that'll just confuse things. And you'll actually get a comment from FEMA saying, why is your channel in value different than the cross section upstream and downstream of it, even though it looks the same? So just avoid that all possible. Help streamline that process if you can. So the first thing you do when you update that model is you rerun it, and we always compare back to the effective. And hopefully when you've done that, you don't see a lot of change. And oftentimes you don't, because the state of Kansas contractors, well, they're awesome. I don't know what to tell you. So basically, you're going to look for a table that looks like something like this. This table will actually go into what we call a floodplain impact study report that documents how the model has changed from the effective. And certainly minor changes are certainly acceptable. I mean, there's no model out there that's perfect, 100% perfect. The whole point of this corrected effective model is to get it to what the true conditions are. Usually you don't see a lot of change, but sometimes you will, and those need to be explained and written up why they are. And make sure you're tying in, make sure your table ties in. So like you can see how my cross sections, I have 0.00 at the downstream and upstream end. You want to make sure that those tie in when you're doing these evaluations, because again, that's a requirement for FEMA that it is tying into the effective study. Determine the minimum water surface elevation plus any applicable freeboard. Here in the state of Kansas, we require 1 foot of freeboard above the base flood elevation. So make sure that you are looking at the base flood elevation, you add 1 foot plus a little bit of fluff for compaction and other things. And that is your goal that you want to try to avoid. That's the height that your pad needs to be set at a minimum so that you're within compliance. Based on and knowing that, then we start laying in groundwork, grading plan. Because this is in a floodway, we're probably going to try to excavate certain areas and then put that fill, build up a pad using that fill material. There are areas in the state of Kansas that have compensatory storage requirements, for example. So if you are doing an activity, you are required, whatever fill you put in the floodplain, you are required to take that fill out of that floodplain so that you're accommodating it. So you'll take a copy of that corrected effective model and you'll put in your proposed conditions. You'll conceptualize this grading, and then you'll update the model based off of that new grading plan. Here's just a really quick example of how that might be done. So basically you can see where we're excavating out an area of the natural ground, and then we're taking fill and we're adding it off to the side there and raising it above the BFE. This is we usually will have these example cross sections, and for each one we'll have an example just like this. And then we always do a net volume comparison to determine how much fill we took out of the floodplain and how much fill we're adding to the floodplain area. Once you update that model and you run it, then you'll compare it back to the corrected effective model. And the goal is to have a net zero change in the water surface elevation so that the 1% annual chance anyways doesn't rise. A common question I get asked is the no rise required for, like, say, the 10-year or the 25-year? And for most jurisdictions, the answer to that is no. In fact, I'll just be honest with everybody. A lot of times when these studies are done, you actually will see a rise in the 10-year or 25-year, but that's not how FEMA reviews it. They review it based off the 1% annual chance. Just be knowledgeable though of your community regulations or the state that you're working in, and make sure that, you know, if they do require a no rise for all events, then you're going to have to check that for each event. Then I put this table together, and that table also goes into the report documenting no rise certification, essentially. In this example, the project is a structure elevated by fill within the regulatory floodway. So a LOMR-F is not applicable. The client can choose to file for a LOMR or a CLOMR. Since they have a no rise, they don't technically have to do a CLOMR, although it's usually recommended. Just keep that in mind. One thing to note, as I mentioned before, if the fill had already, let's say that the fill had been placed prior to the effective date, then technically that fill is grandfathered in and a LOMR-F could be applicable if you can prove the fill was placed prior to the study being done. That would be the only exception to what this statement is up here that I can think of, unless others can think of a reason why that would be true. In this example here, here's all the forms that I would fill out for this application. If I'm doing a CLOMR, I'm going to do all the same type of things, including the ESA compliance. For the LOMR, I would do the same thing. One thing that everybody, I hope, sees as a potential error here is the notification to affected properties. I mean, if it's self-owned or if you have a true no rise, you're not technically required to notify them, but standard of practice would be to go ahead and do it and just say that there's no change. You would want that, in my opinion, just because you don't want neighbors arguing back and forth about it. It's just good practice to do it. I mean, what better letter to basically say, hey, this has been analyzed, FEMA has checked off on it, and they're good with it. It's just good practice, really. So I'm going to skip this. We've already kind of gone through those forms. I showed you the examples that we had for this project. I guess we're on our last poll.
Yes, you should be seeing the last poll now. So John needs to get a lowest adjacent grade elevation for his brand new home, as shown in the example. Which location do you think depicts the most appropriate location to get the LAG?
This is a hard one.
A little bit of a trick.
It is tricky. I admit this one's tricky. Y'all have Steve Samuelson to thank for this one, by the way. I'm not going to take credit for it.
Looks like we have about the same number that have voted previously, so I'm going to go ahead and close the polling and share the results. So we have
So the correct answer was B, at the ground on top of the pad next to the structure. Believe it or not. Would anybody like to argue against that? No.
I'm glad we had no C's.
And no C's. Yeah, no C's. But I can understand why people would select A. Honestly, from an engineering perspective, that's pretty important down there. But technically, I think based off of the guidance, B is actually the correct elevation, which there's two mindsets there. There's the regulatory, what FEMA is evaluating versus the engineering. And yeah, that A is very important, because if that wall falls over, the whole thing's done for. But
Yeah.
B, quick answer. Okay. So some lessons learned that I just want to talk about, and I would like to open this up to see what kind of things people are seeing and what kind of questions they have as we go through this. But the first thing is just make sure to provide that project narrative. It's very important. People tend to overlook that. The more information you can provide, like I said, it helps really confine what the reviewer is looking at. Some of those reviewers are very technical people, and they can kind of tend to get in the weeds and start chasing rabbits down rabbit holes. Clearly define the limits for which you believe the impacts are, so that they can streamline their review process. And make sure to really document that all the information has been provided. I'm a very checklisty type person, so make sure you have a checklist and you go through that and you sign off on all those. In fact, one thing to just mention, there is at the front of this, there's this checklist that FEMA even provides, so that you can kind of go through this and check it off. So just be aware of that. If you don't want to create your own, just know that this one is here to help guide you. I definitely encourage the verbal and virtual communications for projects like this. It's very, 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 very easy to get into a writing campaign, and you do not want to do that. It'll just go back and forth. It becomes a nightmare. Provide prompt response to the comments. Don't wait for your 90-day period to the last day to submit your comments back. Try to do that as quickly as possible, not just from a schedule standpoint, but just also from the standpoint of keeping your mind fresh on the project. It's very easy that, they take 90 days, they get it back to you, maybe they get it back to you in 75 days. You respond, but you wait 60 days. You got to refresh your mind every single time. And you know, if you're a busy engineer or a busy consultant, or you're just plain busy community, you want to try to do this as quickly as you can to turn around comments fast, so it's fresh in your mind. Don't forget the internal checks for the NFIP regulatory mapping requirements. So make sure that that flowway data table, that profile, the BFE, the DFIRM database, I didn't directly address that, I probably should have, but when those regulatory mapping requirements, go through those and check that everything agrees, and even provide that spreadsheet back to FEMA so that they can see it. So they can see that you checked off to make sure that your floodway data table matches the model, that matches the profile. Talked about the community acknowledgement. Make sure that you're going through those and making sure that every community is, you acknowledge every community, and every community signs off, reviews and signs off on it. Obviously, providing notification is very important, especially if you're making changes. You want to make sure that that documentation is provided. Certified mail slips are good. A newspaper article, very good, especially if you have a receipt for it or what have you, showing that when it was published. Making sure you're using compliant models or methodology. We talked about vertical datum conversions earlier. I've seen that as an issue where an engineer gets a model, or maybe it's an old HEC2 model that has elevations in it that was done in NGVD 29. They start throwing in their changes into that HEC2 model. And by the way, for those that are not familiar, HEC2 is like DOS prompt type modeling. So it's very easy to, if it's not documented well, to not use the same units when you're putting the information in. So check that. Make sure that you have sufficient backup data. For all those forms, as you're reading through those, make sure that you're checking off on them. It gets really, as you probably noticed, it gets very, very cumbersome if you're doing levees or dams or anything like that, because there's a lot more to check off on, and make sure that you're providing. Make sure that your work map has all the information on it that's required. Floodplains. When I do the work maps, I typically just make the work maps the same as the floodplain maps. So I'll just use something like this, and it will basically be, there. It'll basically be the exact same FEMA map, but then I just put different information on it if I need to. We talked about this. Make sure your floodplain ties in to the effective floodplain within 1/2 foot. In this day and age, as digital as everything is, there's no reason why we shouldn't be even closer than that. If you can't, and there's a reason for it, you need to document that. And that definitely is something that should be hopefully coordinated with the state, so that the state knows it, and maybe there's a mapping update that needs to be made, as well as the FEMA updates. So one thing that, could happen is somebody does a no-rise, they don't do a CLOMR, and they just do a LOMR, and then they find a mistake in the no-rise. Maybe FEMA reviews it and they say, nope, you can't do that. It needs to, you should have had this change, and you find out by making that change, you no longer have a no-rise certification. So this is a really good example of, this is a really good example of why doing a CLOMR is usually a good idea. I pretty much always recommend that a CLOMR gets done. Certainly there are clients that don't want to do it because they don't want to have to pay the multiple fees. I understand that, but we just want to make sure that we're trying to protect them, that we're trying to protect the community, the state, because nobody wants to see something done that's in non-compliance and then a whole bunch of people get in trouble for it. So that is pretty much my presentation for today. I guess I'd like to open it up for questions. We can go back to anything in the example that I provided or any of the forms that I provided and talk through anything. If anybody has any examples that they have that they would like to know how we might do an application for it, I'll just open the floor.
There are no questions in the chat, but that last poll was noted that it looked like it might be a basement. So if it was a basement, that A would have been correct in that situation.
Absolutely. Yep.
So that's a good distinction and something you would want to find out if it was something you were really looking at.
Absolutely. Good comment, Carol. You know, Steve, well, if you know Steve, you know he always likes throwing little trick questions out there. Anything else? About 10 minutes here to answer any questions. Our group hasn't become any more voiceful since the first workshop.
There have been a little more.
A few more comments.
You just covered it all and everybody understood. And
It's either that or you're all asleep. One of the two.
Answering the poll questions. That second one was hard and everybody did pretty good on that one.
They did. There was a lot of forms in that one. Well, I've got a few minutes. Tara, Joanna, do you guys have anything else that you would like to add or talk about, I guess?
Following this, we will send out a Survey Monkey along with the links to the recordings. So if you have any feedback on if you'd like this training off again or something similar, any type of, if you found it useful, we'll ask those kind of questions. Otherwise, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, and we should be able to get the certificates out sometime next week as well. If you had sessions and answered the poll questions, we'll review that information and then get those sent out to you too. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate everybody sticking with me through all this. Hopefully you found it fun and useful, or at least learned something. So appreciate it.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, Tara. Bye, Joanna.
Bye.